When you're doing zoning, there's another half to that puzzle, which is, yes, we've separated everything from everything else, but what form are those pieces going to take? And that's planning by coding. We have codes that determine the form of our buildings. They look like this. They're thick and they're onerous, and they often deal with issues that are hard for people to understand because they're just numerical and technical. This is my house, which I show because by the end of these shows, people often think that I only enjoy traditional architecture and that I somehow hate modern architecture. And this is my own house that I designed. But when I built this, I had one of these, I think, this code that I had to deal with, which said certain things like, even though I was 3 blocks from metro rail and many buses, and bicycling is my main way around town, and we didn't own a car, I needed to have a garage in my house. And I had to, and even though none of my neighbors in this historic neighborhood had a garage, so I had to fight for 9 months to not remove an on-street parking space, cut a driveway, and put a garage in my house. And that's what these codes are telling us. But they also deal with issues like FAR, floor area ratio, which is how form is controlled in a way that bears no relationship really to how the building behaves in a city. Floor area ratio is the ratio of the amount of interior space to the size of the lot, and that's what most cities are looking at. But it doesn't care about what matters. So, for example, this is an FAR of 2.0, the infamous dingbat apartments of Los Angeles, probably the worst urban form possible in terms of walking past a building. This is also a FAR of 2.0 in the wonderful neighborhoods of Birmingham, Alabama. This is an FAR of 1.0, the kind of environment that you flee as soon as you've cut your car engine, right? And this is an FAR of 1.0, a development we built outside of Atlanta called Post Riverside. This is an FAR of 0.75, suburbs outside of Toronto. We call it the Snout House, right? And this is an FAR of 0.75, suburbs outside of Toronto, a new development that we built. So it's clear that we need to be controlling, if we're going to control the form of our buildings, we need to control it in a way that's different from FAR. But certainly the lesson that we've learned is that planning by zoning and planning by coding equals planning to fail. And this is a piece that I gave in a lecture to the 750 Canadian planners who came to their national conference. But I was talking about the American example, and this is where I started whistling. So these are some. I'm going to start whistling in a minute, but these are some images that this artist has taken of planning boards in action. I'm sorry, I forget the artist's name. And I've juxtaposed that by a series of photos, many of them by Alex McLean, of the outcomes of that. So here's the American story. Anyway, you get the idea. I've gone beyond my whistling range. But these are the, I mean, it's funny, but it's just so sad that this regime that we've set up, where these are hardworking people, they're typically volunteers, they're no dummies, you know, but working in this system that they have been given to work with, these are the outcomes that are being generated by that activity. So I think most of us agree that the system as it exists now is broken. And in fact, what's really interesting is the entire leadership of the planning associations, the Urban Land Institute, which is the developers' think tank, certainly the leading epidemiologists and thinkers on all of these subjects understand that this is a broken system. That doesn't mean that we've stopped doing it. And I think you have ample evidence around here that the momentum, even in these economic times, the momentum towards creating these places is continuing. And it's like the captain of the Titanic. You know, he spotted the iceberg, and the engines are in full reverse, but it takes a long time to turn that ship around. And we're actually glad, you know, we're all suffering, all of us, particularly planners, in this economy, but we're glad that we've had this respite, that we're having this respite of less development, because we hope that, you know, as we step back and think about the mistakes we've made in how we've financed our communities, we also need to pay attention to how we've designed them, and that it's time to change that just as deeply as we need to change the financial system. So planning by engineering is the other part of separating everything from everything else, and I talked about all the roads that are necessary, but when designing the roads becomes, when the roads become the principal complaint, when a city manager or a city planner asks his people or her people, what is your complaint, and they say traffic, then the whole system, and that's the first thing you hear, because this system is designed to choke on traffic, extremely spread out. If you have to drive everywhere, it's designed to choke on traffic. Then the question becomes, how can we solve the traffic problem? We add lanes and we add lanes, and somehow, these will be the pyramids of the 23rd century, right? Los Angeles and other places. But we keep adding lanes, and we don't find that it's solving the problem. And there's actually a reason for that. And this is one of the points that I struggle to share with every community that I'm in, because the intellectuals know it, and even most of the practitioners know it, but it's not acted upon, is this concept of induced demand. And that this is what typically happens in any community. There's a forecast that roadways need to widen because traffic is increasing, and maybe we're here, and so this is the traffic that we're experiencing. And so the decision is made to widen the road, and what happens is more people choose to drive. And there's a long explanation for this, and if some of you want to take an hour and sit with me after this, we'll go through all the reasons why this happens. But there's essentially this demand, induced demand, which is the amount that people would choose to drive more if their traffic was reduced. And people make trips or choose not to make trips based on the perception of how much traffic they're going to encounter. They also make decisions like, how far will I live from my office? Or, boy, that house that's 20 minutes further away from work has really sexy bathrooms, and it's easy to get there, so I'm just going to move there. And the experience, the great contrast there is Atlanta versus Portland, where Atlanta, through the 70s and 80s, Atlanta pretty much doubled its highway miles, and Portland created an urban growth boundary and invested in transit. And what they accomplished in Atlanta was they lengthened the average commute from 20 minutes to 40 minutes. And what they accomplished in Portland is actually people drive less now in Portland than they did in 1970. So that's the outcome of creating more roadways, is you just induce more demand. And everyone knows this now. This is from Newsweek magazine, where it says, building more roads, that's expensive, and demand from drivers tends to quickly overwhelm the new supply. Today's engineers acknowledge that building new roads usually makes traffic worse. Unfortunately, these are not the engineers that I deal with daily. These are just engineers who lead the profession, but a lot of engineers went to school a long time ago, and they're not necessarily aware of this. So the catchy way to say it is trying to cure traffic congestion with more capacity is like trying to cure obesity by loosening your belt. That's a bit rude, but it's the exact same mechanism at work. You allow something to happen that couldn't happen otherwise. And then the traffic planners are like, whoa, Or they say, actually, I told you so. I told you that we needed this new road. Look how choked in traffic it is. But it's the new road that's created that new traffic. The British know this. Many years ago, they stopped building new roads in England. And new roads can cause traffic jams. We're slowly catching up. And then there's the complete misinformation that you see, and this is a firm that I've worked with from time to time in Planning Magazine, saying vehicle miles traveled increased by 97% from 1980 to 1996. And if we only improve the infrastructure improvements could significantly reduce the $78 billion of fuel lost to congestion each year. So here they're saying the solution to congestion and all that waste is to build more roads, when supposedly we know that that's not true. But this is still the stuff you hear. So I'm here to share that with you. And so we just build more and more gold-plated horizontal infrastructure, ignoring the quality of our vertical infrastructure like schools and other public, city halls, and putting all our money into this just to allow ourselves to drive more and further and to experience this frustration. And this is not Photoshop. This is an actual light outside of Orlando. I thank Walter Kulash for the slide, but there's a reason for this. It's just not worth getting into. And then in addition to more roads, we create wider roads, and ever wider. The standards keep increasing because if we're stuck in congestion, which actually, congestion is the outcome not of lane widths, but of what's happening in intersections. But if we widen the lanes, maybe people could move a little more smoothly, so you have the, what we call the road so wide you can see the curvature of the earth, which is leading to a little housing subdivision. And here are two images up above Rockville, Maryland, one from the 70s and one from the 90s, but these are surprisingly taken from the same height. And look at the width of the roads. Look at the width of the roads in the 70s subdivision and the width of the roads in the 90s subdivision. So the standards of my staff always sticks this somewhere in my slideshow. I'm sorry. So the standards It's an ongoing joke. The standards keep changing, and this is my neighborhood in Miami, where they had to fix the curbs for stormwater, and they had to fix them to the new standards. So even though South Beach, this wonderful neighborhood, was functioning perfectly well, no one was trapped on these supposedly narrow streets. Now a 6-foot sidewalk has become a 3-foot sidewalk because of this new standard. And of course, people drive faster on these streets. And luckily, a number of communities, this is actually Birmingham, Michigan, but a number of communities, grassroots efforts, the citizens are rising up and saying, let's bring our streets back to reasonable widths. And you have things like Portland's Skinny Street program, the kind of streets that we all grew up on that are now illegal. And this is a big part of what we're trying to do as well. And then the idea about, actually, let me see where I'm going here. Oh, and then the idea about the width of the lanes and how those impact our safety in different communities. And the fact that the most dangerous intersections, of course, are the ones that correspond perfectly to the Department of Transportation requirements. And as the roads get wider, and frankly, the buildings pull further back, and they do pull further back because the roads are noxious, drivers go faster and faster. Here you see the tremendous difference between a 30-mile-an-hour and a 45-mile-an-hour speed, and we were driving 45 on our way in here this morning because that was the natural speed to go on these community streets because of how they felt. And the difference to a pedestrian is life and death. So, what can you do about that? And part of that is just to post speed limits. There's this whole movement in England called 20 is Plenty. That's a huge grassroots movement where for entire neighborhoods within the city and for some smaller cities, for the entire downtown, they're posting a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. But drivers, particularly European drivers, don't necessarily follow speed limits. We drive the speed at which we feel safe, not at the speed at which we're told to drive. And so, how can you design communities actually so that people will drive a little bit slower? And it has to do with having the lanes the right width and confusing intersections like this intersection in Stuart, Florida, where my old partners were brought in to fix it because it was a nightmare. But in fact, it was the safest such intersection. It was the safest high-volume intersection in South Florida because it was 7 roads, a railroad track. No one knew what to do. They were scared. And they drove much more slowly. And this is where this belongs, in contrast to the conventional. And people are always wondering, because the reason I bring this up is most places where I work, it's illegal to make complex intersections. You have to have 90-degree angles. You can't have staggers. You can't have cranks and other things that make for great communities. So I always point to this chart of Sweden. And we know, seat belts were introduced and airbags were introduced. But what happened in 1966, 67, that caused that one year to drop? And what it was they'd switched from driving on the left-hand side of the street to driving on the right-hand side of the street. So the fear and the confusion caused by changing their entire traffic patterns, principal outcome was to save lives. So based on this, we should actually switch every year back and forth, and we'd save millions of, thousands of lives. But just so you know who to trust and what to think about conventional wisdom, this quote, "The possible benefits of required seatbelts would not justify the costs to the manufacturers and the public." Was this GM saying this? No, it was the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in 1970. So, thinking evolves, we learn new things, and we just need to act upon those things to improve our community. And just the idea that we're now a society of specialists, and someone's specialized in the width of the roads, and someone's specialized in making sure that in the 100-year storm, that road is dry in 10 seconds. But you can't let anyone, and when I lecture to mayors, I always say, Mayor, your job is to be the generalist, because everyone's going to tell you that they need something that's special for them, but in fact, only generalists can design cities, because cities have to work for all of us. So this is a fun series of slides at what's happened to our society because we've been planning around the automobile and the expectation of automobile ownership. And I actually got these slides from Howard Frumkin. And Howard Frumkin is an epidemiologist who goes around the country lecturing on how we design our communities impacts our health. And he says, what if in America we were asked to design, what if our goal, what if the federal government had said, design your communities so that no one will ever choose to walk? What would we do? And the answer is, well, you'd of course have the streets with no sidewalks, plenty of those here, as there are elsewhere. The street edge where there is a sidewalk, but you can't get the stroller on it. the sidewalk that exists, but it's just so close to such a fat roadway that no one ever would choose to take it, an unprotected sidewalk. Or you just put the pole in the middle of the sidewalk. What the heck? When the sidewalk becomes decoration, there's no reason to actually have it work. The sidewalks that end or the sidewalks that pass in the night. Or just say it, no pedestrians, because that's what's happening anyway. And so we've created this whole society built around driving, and the drive-in grocery store, and the drive-in bakery, the drive-in flowers, liquor store is something you find a lot in the South, and in Florida where I lived, the drive-through liquor store always worries me. And then, every aspect of life. You can get married in your car. When it doesn't work out, you can pay child support in your car. And as you get older, pharmacy and even the mortuary that you can drive through. I've never really understood this one exactly, but you get the idea. But then that gets into the whole society we've created and the health problems and the fact that we no longer have a reason to live actively, and that's the other half, or that's a big half of the epidemiology discussion. And so we have planning for health, which started the planning profession, but we have planning for health now. And planning for health now is outlined in this great book. It's a textbook, but it reads very well, by Howie Frumkin and also Larry Frank and Dick Jackson, that points out all the different ways that we're actually killing ourselves with the design of our communities, and increased air pollution and asthma, traffic injuries, of course, decreased physical activity, heat island effects, income segregation, which is social segregation, which creates decreased social capital, negative mental health impacts, et cetera. The correlation of asthma in cities to where the highways are located. Lots of discussion. And USA Today very surprises me with the number of articles it has that discuss issues like this. And then the whole child obesity epidemic, which is probably the biggest challenge we face physically in the country. It says, remember when we used to have to fatten the kids up first? And it's humorous, but we're now looking at 1/3, according to the National Centers for Disease Control, we're looking at 1/3 of all Americans born after 2000 being diabetics. And diabetes currently consumes 2% of our GNP. So it's a hugely expensive disease, vastly proliferating disease. And part of it is our completely misguided national policy regarding how we produce food. And if any of you have seen, read The Omnivore's Dilemma or seen the movie King Corn, about how, 25% of our corn is going towards sweeteners and 75% is going towards essentially cows 3 times as fat as they should be, and making meat much less healthy than it should be. I think the biggest problem our country faces before suburban sprawl is our food policy. But that's not my specialty. My specialty is suburban sprawl. So we'll talk about the other aspect of that. And, it's calories in, but it's also calories out. And the fact that we've eliminated the useful walk and the useful bike from our lives is one of the problems. Bowling Alone, a great book about how you can, this statistician, Robert Putnam, essentially discovered that he could correlate people's commuting length with the number of community organizations that they belong to, inverse proportion, and how basically the time we spend in cars is eroding our communities. And then this idea about income-based segregation. And we don't think twice when we drive down the street and we see signs like this. But what if they were more straightforward and told us what we were really doing to our society? These slides also from Howard Frumkin. This should concern us that we're atomizing more than we ever have in our history by very precise segments of income generation.